At 6:30 this evening, less than 90 minutes before his own deadline, the administration announced a 2-week ceasefire. 12 hours earlier, a civilization was supposed to die tonight. Both statements are in the documented record. The distance between them is what this brief is about.
At approximately 6:30 in the evening on April 7th, 2026, less than 90 minutes before his own deadline expired, the President of the United States posted a message on Truth Social announcing that he had agreed to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks. The ceasefire, he wrote, was double-sided. The reason for doing so, he continued, was that the United States had already met and exceeded all military objectives, and was very far along with a definitive agreement concerning long-term peace with Iran and peace in the Middle East. 12 hours earlier, the same president had written that a whole civilization would die tonight, never to be brought back again. Both statements are in the documented record. Both were written by the same hand. Both were posted to the same platform. And the distance between them, 12 hours, a Pakistani phone call, and a 10-point plan that the president called not good enough on Monday and a workable basis on Tuesday, is what this brief is about. Not because the ceasefire is bad news. A pause in a conflict that has killed more than 3,400 people and closed the world's most important oil shipping route for 38 days is not bad news. It is a development that every energy market on Earth reacted to instantly. S&P 500 futures rose more than 1%. Oil futures dropped approximately 6% within minutes of the announcement, according to Axios. The ceasefire is real. The pause is real. The document matters and the stakes of the next 2 weeks are genuine. What this brief examines is what the sequence of events that produced this ceasefire tells us about the terms of the agreement, the 10-point plan that nobody has fully published, and what the next 14 days actually require to be true for this pause to become something more permanent.
This is Stratford Brief. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next 2 weeks will produce documents that tell us what was actually agreed. We will cover all of it. Let's continue.
Let me establish the factual sequence precisely, because the timeline is the argument. On Sunday, April 5th, the administration announced a rescue operation. The president described it as one of the most daring in American military history. The Secretary of Defense said Iran was embarrassed and humiliated. The CIA director described capabilities that no other intelligence service in the world possesses.
Iran accepted within 30 minutes, then released a statement declaring victory. The United States said it had met and exceeded all military objectives. Both sides declared victory from the same agreement. That is the first question the documented record cannot yet resolve.
The message was dominance. On Monday, April 6th, a Reuters correspondent asked the president directly whether the war was winding down or escalating. The answer was, "I can't tell you. I don't know. It depends what they do." The same day, the president called Iran's 10-point proposal not good enough, but a very significant step. He extended his deadline from Monday night to Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. The stated reason for the extension was that it felt inappropriate to have a deadline expire on Easter Sunday. On Tuesday, April 7th, the president posted that a whole civilization will die tonight. He threatened every bridge and every power plant in Iran. He said the entire country could be taken out in one night. Meanwhile, the United States struck Karg Island, Iran's oil export hub, handling approximately 90% of its oil exports, according to the Washington Times, in what officials described as restrikes on military targets first hit in March. Israel struck Iranian railways and bridges. The escalation was already underway, while the deadline was still active. Then, at approximately 6:30 p.m., Eastern Pakistan's Prime Minister formally requested a 2-week extension. The president said he would be briefed. Less than 90 minutes later, before the 8 p.m. deadline arrived, the ceasefire was announced. Iran accepted within 30 minutes, according to Newsweek, which reported that the new supreme leader personally approved the deal. The Iranian foreign minister confirmed that for 2 weeks, safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. Iran's Supreme National Security Council simultaneously released a statement declaring victory. That is the documented sequence. Now let me examine what each part of it actually means. Before we go deeper, if this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, The official narrative surrounding tonight's ceasefire has a specific architecture, and I want to present it completely before examining what the record underneath it shows. The administration's argument, as stated in the Truth Social announcement and in the subsequent statements from officials, is as follows. 40 days of intensive military operations achieved and exceeded all stated military objectives. The threat of decisive escalation, the civilization-level language, the infrastructure ultimatum, created the pressure that diplomacy alone could not. Pakistan served as the bridge. Iran blinked. A workable basis for negotiation now exists, and a 2-week window has been created to finalize a long-term agreement. The markets responded with relief. S&P futures rose. Oil fell 6%. The financial signal confirms the strategic one.
Friday, Islamabad. The Vice President leads the delegation. The documents from those negotiations will tell us what was actually agreed.
That narrative is not fabricated. The markets did respond that way. Pakistan did serve as the mediating bridge. The ceasefire is real, and there is a legitimate analytical argument that the pressure campaign, whatever its costs, produced a negotiating moment that did not exist 38 days ago. The question that the documented record raises is not whether the ceasefire is real. It is whether the characterization of what produced it, and what the next 2 weeks require, corresponds to what the documents actually show. Let me go through the 10-point plan specifically, because the administration has described it as a workable basis on which to negotiate, and almost all of the various points of past contention have been agreed to. Those are significant claims. The documented record allows partial verification of what is actually in the plan. According to reporting from the New York Times, citing 2 senior Iranian officials, confirmed by Iran's state news agency IRNA, and cross-referenced by Reuters, the Kyiv Post, and the Oman Observer, the known elements of Iran's 10-point proposal include the following: a guarantee that Iran will not be attacked again, the lifting of all sanctions, an end to Israeli strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, with a transit fee of approximately $2 million per ship, split with Oman, with Iran's share used to fund reconstruction of damaged infrastructure, rather than direct compensation. Recognition of Iran's right to enrich uranium under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There is one more element that deserves specific attention, because it was published not by an Iranian outlet making unverified claims, but by CNN, which reported on a statement released by Iran's Supreme National Security Council within hours of the ceasefire announcement. The Council stated that the United States has in principle agreed to lift all primary and secondary sanctions against Iran, to withdraw U.S. combat forces from all bases in the region, and to accept Iran's nuclear enrichment and recognize Iran's continued control over the Strait of Hormuz. CNN noted it had reached out to U.S. officials for comment on these claims. As of this recording, no official U.S. response to those specific characterizations has been published. I want to be precise about what the analytical responsibility here requires. The Iranian Supreme National Security Council statement is a primary source document from one party to an active negotiation. It represents Iran's characterization of what was agreed, not a verified account of the terms of the agreement. The U.S. has not confirmed or denied those specific claims. The gap between what Iran says was agreed and what the U.S. says was agreed is not yet resolvable from the public record. That gap is significant, because the difference between a ceasefire that pauses military operations while negotiations continue on contested terms, and a ceasefire where the United States has in principle accepted Iran's nuclear enrichment and committed to withdrawing all forces from the region, are not the same agreement. They are 2 categorically different outcomes with categorically different implications for America's strategic position in the Middle East, for the alliance relationships with Gulf states that have been under strain for 38 days, and for the domestic political calculation that will determine whether the next 2 weeks produce a durable settlement or another expired deadline. Now let me examine the strategic logic of the position both sides are now in, because that logic determines what the next 2 weeks actually require. For Iran, the documented record shows a negotiating position that has strengthened measurably across 40 days. The Strait of Hormuz was closed, and remains effectively closed. A U.S. F-15E was downed. Karg Island, which the United States restruck on Tuesday, had already been struck in March, which means the restrike targeted infrastructure that had not been fully neutralized by the first strike. Iran's Supreme National Security Council publicly declared victory within hours of the ceasefire, without any apparent concern that the declaration would undermine the negotiations. That declaration tells you something about where Tehran assesses its leverage. The 10-point plan was described by the Iranian side as having forced the United States to accept its core demands. The detail that Iran will coordinate, rather than simply allow passage through Hormuz, is analytically significant. Coordination implies Iranian authority over the waterway remains in effect. Ships pass with Iran's permission, not despite Iran's position. That is a different condition than the complete, immediate, and safe opening that the ceasefire announcement described as the condition for the pause. For the United States, the ceasefire provides relief from an escalation trajectory that had produced serious institutional strain. The congressional opposition to infrastructure strikes was bipartisan and growing. Former MAGA allies were calling for the 25th Amendment. The market response to escalation was punishing. Oil at $114 per barrel during a press conference is a politically visible number. The ceasefire announcement dropped oil 6% immediately. That financial signal is the clearest indicator of what the ceasefire was worth domestically in the short term. The strategic question, the one the next 2 weeks will force an answer to, is whether the domestic relief the ceasefire provides corresponds to a durable diplomatic framework or to another pause in a trajectory that has not been resolved. The historical precedent I want to examine here is specific, and the comparison is deliberate. January 27, 1973. The Paris Peace Accords. The United States and North Vietnam signed a ceasefire agreement that included the withdrawal of American forces from South Vietnam. The agreement was presented as peace with honor. The official characterization at the time was that the United States had achieved its objectives. The South Vietnamese government remained in place. The North had agreed to a ceasefire. 2 years and 3 months later, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The South Vietnamese government ceased to exist. I am not suggesting the current conflict will follow that trajectory. The adversaries are different. The geography is different. The nuclear dimension of the current conflict has no Vietnam equivalent. The comparison is not about outcomes. It is about the mechanism of ceasefire agreements that are described as victories by both sides simultaneously. When Iran's Supreme National Security Council issues a statement calling the ceasefire an undeniable, historic, and crushing defeat for the United States, and the United States describes the same agreement as having met and exceeded all military objectives. Both statements cannot reflect the same factual assessment of what was agreed. One of them describes the agreement accurately, and the other does not. Or more precisely, both describe what each side believes it achieved, which may or may not correspond to what was actually agreed. The next 2 weeks of negotiations will determine which characterization holds. The Paris parallel is not about what happened in Vietnam after 1973. It is about what the pattern of a ceasefire described as victory by both parties tells us about the durability of the agreement. In 1973, the North Vietnamese characterization turned out to be closer to accurate than the American one. In 2026, the analytical question, the one this brief cannot yet resolve, is which side's characterization of what was agreed corresponds more closely to the actual terms of the 10-point plan, whose full text has not been published. Now let me examine who benefits from each element of this specific ceasefire structure, because the financial trail is always part of this brief, and tonight is no exception. Oil dropped 6% within minutes of the announcement. That movement represents billions of dollars in market positions. The traders who held short positions in oil futures during today's session, who bet on a ceasefire before it was announced, captured a significant portion of that 6% drop. The question of who had advanced knowledge of the ceasefire structure is not answerable from the public record tonight. What is answerable is the sequence. Karg Island was struck Tuesday morning. While deadline negotiations were ongoing, oil was at $110 per barrel, and then dropped to approximately $104 within an hour of the announcement. The financial beneficiaries of that sequence are identifiable in market records that are public. Stratford Brief will examine those records as they become available. The defense industry dimension is also worth establishing. The 6-week conflict has involved, according to multiple assessments, over $100 billion in military expenditure. The specific contractors whose equipment was deployed, from the precision-guided munitions used in strikes on Karg Island to the MC-130J aircraft destroyed in the F-15 rescue operation, represent the financial layer beneath the strategic narrative. A 2-week ceasefire does not terminate procurement. It creates a window in which the Pentagon assesses what was used, what needs replacement, and what future procurement priorities look like. Those decisions are made in the next 2 weeks. They are not paused by the ceasefire. The question of what comes next is now specifically defined by what the 10-point plan actually contains, and whether the U.S. and Iranian characterizations of what was agreed converge or diverge in the coming days. The indicator to watch is not whether the Strait of Hormuz opens in the next 48 hours. It is how the passage is characterized when it does open. If Iranian naval vessels are visibly coordinating ship movements through the strait, as the Iranian foreign minister described, that is not the complete, immediate, and safe opening that the announcement described. It is a managed passage under Iranian authority. The distinction between those two conditions is the difference between the U.S. achieving its stated objective for the ceasefire, and Iran achieving its stated objective of maintaining control over the waterway. The second indicator to watch is the Friday negotiations in Islamabad. According to Axios, the vice president is likely to lead the U.S. delegation. The specific agenda of those negotiations, which elements of the 10-point plan are accepted, contested, or rejected, will determine whether the 2-week window produces a durable framework or another expiring deadline. Stratford Brief will cover every development of those negotiations with the same methodology applied throughout this conflict. What was said, what the documents show, and what the gap between those two things tells us about where this is heading. The third indicator is the Israeli response. Israel agreed to the ceasefire and will suspend strikes, according to a White House official cited by Axios. But the Israeli government's domestic position, Prime Minister Netanyahu faces pressure from within his coalition to reject any agreement that does not include the full dismantlement of Iran's military capability, creates a structural tension with any framework that leaves Iran's nuclear enrichment intact. Iran's 10-point plan explicitly includes recognition of its right to enrich uranium. If that recognition is part of the agreed framework, the Israeli coalition pressure on Netanyahu will intensify in ways that could complicate American ratification of whatever is negotiated in Islamabad. Based on what the full documented record shows, the 12-hour sequence from civilization dies tonight to double-sided ceasefire, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council's declaration of victory, and its claims about what was agreed, the discrepancy between Iran's coordination of Hormuz Passage and the complete and immediate opening described in the announcement, the full text of the 10-point plan that has not been published, and the competing characterizations of what 40 days of military operations actually achieved. The picture that emerges is of a ceasefire that is real, significant, and genuinely welcome, as a pause in a conflict that has produced enormous costs. It is also a ceasefire whose terms are contested by the parties to it within hours of its announcement. That is not a reason for pessimism. Contested terms are negotiated terms. Negotiated terms can produce durable agreements. The next 2 weeks will determine whether this one does. The question this brief cannot yet answer, and the one every serious analyst should be tracking through the Islamabad negotiations, is whether the 10-point plan that the president called not good enough on Monday and a workable basis on Tuesday contains the elements that both sides claim it contains. Because if Iran's characterization is accurate, if the United States has in principle agreed to lift all sanctions, accept nuclear enrichment, and recognize Iranian control of the strait, then what was achieved in 40 days of operations is a fundamentally different outcome than what was stated as the objective when operations began on February 28th. And if the U.S. characterization is accurate, if almost all points have been agreed to on terms consistent with the stated objectives, then Iran's declaration of crushing defeat for the United States is a domestic narrative that will complicate Tehran's ability to implement whatever was agreed. Stratford Brief will be in Islamabad analytically, if not physically, on Friday. The documents that emerge from those negotiations will tell us which characterization holds. We will report what they show. The mainstream coverage tells you what happened. Stratford Brief tells you what it means. New brief tomorrow. I'm James Caldwell. Stay sharp.